We can now go across to Christopher Sabatini, Senior Research Fellow for Latin America, US, and the Americas program at Chatham House. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank
Locals
you.
have been criticizing the government's slow response in Venezuela. What does this tragedy demonstrate about Delcy Rodriguez's ability to lead the country, and is she really in control now?
It's complicated. So first of all, you've had over 20 years, 27 years to be precise, of a one-party state that has effectively squandered the profits of oil revenue and an oil windfall, in fact, in the early 2000s, and also engaged in massive corruption, hyperinflation, economic mismanagement. And that has meant that they really haven't invested in some of the key areas that would have allowed them a more efficient and effective response to this crisis. There's also some concerns about really being quite lax in enforcing coding standards, building code standards, and the like. So there's also this legacy of the past regime. And then you have Delcy Rodriguez, who's only an interim president. She was put in place after Donald Trump extracted Nicolas Maduro in January. So according to popular opinion polls before this event, she only had about 25% approval rating. So she's already quite is a lame duck president, if you will, who had very low popularity. And so these concerns are really going to strain the legitimacy and the popular support for her presidency, except perhaps for Donald Trump, who's a man who put her in place, who claims that she's still doing well. But that obviously could also create a split between the Venezuelans themselves, who are complaining and frustrated, as you noted, and the U.S. policy right now.
And what has the U.S. position been as in the aftermath of these earthquakes? Has the U.S. come to Venezuela's rescue?
Yes, the U.S. has allocated about $300 million of assistance. That's only really a pittance of what is going to be necessary, but it's emergency relief assistance. The U.S. Southern Command has now sent troops, I think about 300, 200 or so soldiers are on the ground helping to coordinate assistance. They've also parked oddly enough, one of the boats that was off the coast before the extraction of Nicolas Maduro, they've now parked off the coast, and they're using that to offload supplies and coordinate assistance. They've also supposedly rebuilt a port. So they are there and they're active. The problem is, of course, is the scale of this disaster is tremendous, and even the infrastructure to get to some of these places has been very limited. So even their impact and attempts to coordinate the 20-plus international assistance teams that have arrived in Venezuela is very difficult. And as we're seeing, that window of opportunity, that 72-hour window of opportunity to recover living survivors, it has effectively closed. So it's going to be a tough haul, but there's a lot more to do, setting up tent camps, temporary housing for everyone, as well as clearing the debris. And there's rumors that there is a tropical storm on the way in Venezuela, which will complicate all those efforts.
And in the immediate aftermath, I know you said that the 72-hour window has now come and gone. And of course, if rescue workers are able to pull out anyone alive at this point in time, it would be nothing short of a miracle. But after that, in the immediate aftermath, considering that you said there's been this one-party system for 27 years, there's been so much corruption, will they need to be a swift audit of the buildings that are still standing? Because from what I understand, some 58,000 buildings are damaged or destroyed.
There will have to be this audit, and that will really be the moment of reckoning. Look, in many of these disasters, citizens complain about the slow response of the government. That's quite common. They need immediate help. But when we begin to trace the roots of this crisis, it is a natural disaster, which was unavoidable, but it's one that's piled on top of a human disaster, which is basically the lack of rule of law, a hollowed out state, a willy-nilly building that occurred in many of these places that didn't meet any basic standards, not let alone standards for earthquakes. There will have to be a reckoning, and that's really when I think this government is going to be truly tried for what it has done and the conditions it's left its people, while it continued to consolidate its power, repress the opposition, as well as steal billions of dollars from the public treasury.
I want to talk about the opposition for a second, because Venezuela's opposition leader, Maria Machado, Nobel laureate, we should add, who gave her Nobel Prize to Donald Trump, says she wants to return to the country and help with the relief effort. But Washington is not pleased to hear that and are asking her to delay her return. Why is that?
I think there are two reasons. First one is, of course, that Donald Trump and even Marco Rubio have, bet on Delcy Rodriguez. The three-stage plan that only Marco Rubio has mentioned, not Donald Trump, was stabilization, economic recovery, and transition. But what that transition would look like and what role for a democratic election, even democratization and the rule of law and human rights was never clear. So for them, they wanted to maintain this idea of Venezuela as a success story. In fact, we heard about this when Donald Trump talked about the Venezuela model in Iran. Obviously, it didn't work out in Iran and doesn't appear to be working out right now in Venezuela either. So what that meant was he wanted to avoid any sort of disruption to the sense that there's a stable partner, pro-U.S. partner in the U.S. in Delcy Rodriguez. So the idea that Maria Corina Machado, who's very popular in Venezuela, but about a 60 to 70% approval rating, that she would arrive and basically mobilize people to criticize the government is anathema to the White House. But on the other hand, there is a concern here that this is this a moment to return to Venezuela in the midst of this recovery effort and engage in politics? She says she wants to help people, but it could risk being a huge distraction. So, in both cases, the Trump administration really would prefer to have her out of the picture, certainly now. But there is an open question of, is this the best time to return?
We don't have any official figures in terms of how many people could be laying under the rubble. So the death toll could rise quite substantially from the 1,700 that we know right now. Given that the country has a long way to go to get back on its feet, won't this tragedy delay quite significantly Venezuela's return to democracy, but with elections, for instance?
That is a really key question here, because on the one hand, yes, given the scale of the disaster, all the logistical needs that would be necessary to register voters, to carry out the elections, as well as the pending ones which were never even being addressed before, which is the reform of the Election Commission, a whole voter registration update, primaries for candidates, and even deciding which election should be held. President, National Assembly, local, it was never really clear. So there's a whole series of steps that had to be taken even before this disaster. The problem now, though, is you've got a president who has no popular legitimacy. Delcy Rodriguez was a vice president of an extracted former president who had been indicted by the United States. So the U.S. is going to need, and Venezuelans are going to need, some sort of safety valve, some sort of legitimate government that can sort of effectively address people's concerns and have the faith and confidence of those people. So despite all of the complications of having elections, in some ways, this is one of the most important times to have an election. Maybe not immediately, but certainly at least setting a date so in the near future, people can have some expectations of a popularly elected and legitimate government that is directing the disaster assistance that we're seeing right now on the screen, but that is so necessary.
Indeed. Christopher Sabatini, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank you very much.